Thank you, Diane. And thank everybody for dialing into this Zoom meeting. It's the first Zoom presentation for me.
Can't quite hear.
Okay, so
You cannot hear me?
I can hear you, but can other people hear him? No? A little louder.
Can't hear him.
You can hear me or not?
Can people hear? A little bit. Okay, we can hear you a little bit. So you're gonna have to talk a little bit louder.
All right, let me just try to get as close as I can to the computer, and I'll talk as loudly as I possibly can. And I hope my voice doesn't fade as the evening goes on. But
Okay.
This is a book that was obviously a very personal story for me.
We can't hear him at all. Can he do something else to make us hear it?
Um,
Okay, he's working on it. Hold on.
Can you hear me better now?
No?
Um,
No.
Let me go back to that. This is the way that you can hear me best, right, Diane?
I can hear you best, but that's me.
Have everyone turn their sound up on their computers. That's what I did.
That might help too.
If everybody did, yeah, everybody should turn up their own volume as much as they possibly can, I think. I don't think I can do this I mean, when I look at this on my system, I've got it as high as it can go.
Okay. All right.
I
All right.
apologize.
Well, what we can do. That's okay.
But let me go on. It's a story that's told on many levels, and on one level, it's a love story. My parents' love for one another is obviously palpable throughout this book. On March 24th of 1945, my mother wrote to my father, "I haven't a secret in the world from you, and I never want one. Why is it I could never talk to mother or daddy as I can talk to you? Sometimes I think it is natural. There is only one person in the world for everybody, and it's not likely to be a parent. It's more likely, I think, to be the person one is in love with. But the only true comprehensive love is the giving of oneself, body, soul, and mind to the one person whom God made to receive it. And in my case, that person is you, and can never be anybody else." A few days earlier, on March 21st, my father had written to my mother, "I like especially to think of when we had tea on the grass behind the house with the children eating supper, and all I had to worry about was which gray birch trees I should cut down so we could get a little bit more evening sun and still not spoil the effect of the moonlight in the goat pasture." And all their letters end, "I love you." But the letters are more than expressions of love. They tell of a young married couple with 4 children separated by a world at war over which they had no control. They tell of how they handled forced separation after 6 years of marriage, of my father's reliance on luck to survive, and my mother's dependence on God to return to her the husband she had to let go. And it is a story of the war, or at least a portion of the war that is fought by the 10th Mountain Division in Italy's northern Apennines. And it is a story of life on the home front. 2 early memories. One of them, a late August day in 1944. My mother, sister, brother, and I are at the New Haven Railroad station. For a youngster of 3.5, the station appears to be filled with khaki trees. My father is there to board a troop train heading to Camp Swift, just east of Austin, Texas, to join the 10th Mountain Division's 87th Regiment, where they had been moved a month earlier. My mother does not know when or if she will see him again. A sad day. A second memory, another railroad station. This one in Nashua, New Hampshire, a little less than a year later, August 15th, 1945, VJ Day. My father has just gotten off the troop train. We run towards him, horns are blaring, music is playing, lights are flashing. The war was over. A happy day. This book is a story of what happened to two people between that late August day in 1944 and VJ Day almost 1 year later. And the story begins, my mother was 33 and my father was 34. To put this in perspective, a little bit of history. On June 5th, 1944, an invasion force left Pearl Harbor for the Mariana Islands. On the same day, the Germans evacuated Rome. And the next day, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The question by mid-1944 was not who would win the war, but how long would it take and how many more would have to die before the enemy surrendered. It was the Germans evacuating Rome that was the catalyst for the deployment of the 10th Mountain Division to the European theater, specifically to Italy. Having evacuated Rome, the Germans retreated north and formed what was known as the Gothic Line, which stretched across the northern Apennines from the Adriatic on the east to the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west. And the operation to remove the Germans from the Apennines was called Operation Encore, as previous attempts in the fall of 1944 had failed. The key was Mount Belvedere, which the Germans had fortified and which overlooked the main highway going north. The 10th shipped out of Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia, aboard two ships beginning at the end of December 1944. The last to sail was the 87th on January 3rd, aboard the USS West Point, which had been built 4.5 years earlier as the SS America. On arrival in Italy, my father wrote to my mother, the boat trip wasn't too bad, though even a sardine would have called it cozy. From Naples, they were shipped north to Livorno and then trucked east towards Pistoia. For the first month, events near the front were fairly quiet, deceptively so. But on the 16th of February, they were moved to a staging area near the foot of Belvedere in preparation for the assault. The attack occurred in two phases. On the 18th, 700 men of the 86 climbed the 2,000-foot River Ridge using 5 routes, 2 of which required ropes. They arrived undetected and silenced the guns aimed at Belvedere's slopes. Casualties were light. The next day, the 19th, with the Germans now alerted, the rest of the division attacked their fortifications on Belvedere, the highest peak in the northern Apennines. They also attacked 2 adjoining peaks, Mount Gorgolesco and Mount Galataratio. They succeeded, but with significant casualties. With counterattacks and mopping up, the operation took about a week. Over the 73 days from February 18th until the German surrender in Italy on May 2nd, the 10th fought across 150 miles from River Ridge in Belvedere to the shores of Lake Garda, about 25 miles west of Verona. It is a trip today that takes less than 3 hours by car. They fought over mountain passes, through small villages, traversed the Po Valley and crossed the Po River under enemy bombardment. The saddest sight, my father used to tell me, was the plight of displaced people in ruined houses, small children, women, and old men. In all, the 10th lost 992 dead and over 4,000 wounded, one of the highest casualty rates of any American division based on time in battle. 6% of those who served in the 10th in Italy were killed versus approximately 2.5% for all soldiers who served in the war. And even during the 4 days of fighting around Lake Garda, as the war in Italy came to an end, the 10th suffered 333 casualties, including 63 dead. By the end of the fighting, nearly half of the 10th had joined the division as replacements. In C companies of the 87th, my father's company, 28 men were killed, 9.2% of the 306 men who served in his company. A staggering number, given their time in battle. But to go back a little bit and put this in perspective, my father had been drafted in March 1944. He was 33 at the time and father of 3. Upon leaving basic training, he was transferred to the mountain troops. And that summer he turned 34 and his 4th child was born. But to better understand my family, let me just very briefly mention some of their unusual qualities. We all think of our families as being unique, but mine really were. My parents were married in 1938 and chose to live as artists on a rocky farm in New Hampshire, on land that belonged to my paternal grandparents. There they, in order of priority, practiced sculpture, kept horses, goats, and chickens, and raised 9 children. Their lives in New Hampshire were quite different from the ones in which they had been raised. Both had been brought up in pretty well-off surroundings. My mother in New Haven in Madison, Connecticut, and my father in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and Peterborough, New Hampshire. My mother went to Foxcroft School in Virginia, and then to Madame Boney's finishing school in Rome. My father went to Belmont Hill School and then to Harvard. In 1932, my mother's father became a victim of Ivar Kruger. Some of you may know him. He was known as the Swedish Match King and probably the biggest Ponzi scheme until Bernie Madoff. And he lost most of his money in that situation. But a story that sort of illustrates their unusual lifestyle. At some point in the early 1950s, 51 or 52, we were headed from New Hampshire to spend a week or so with my paternal grandmother in Madison, Connecticut. My father was driving our 1941 Ford station wagon, and there were perhaps 6 or 7 children in the car, plus assorted dogs and cats. And in the trailer behind was our Shetland pony and a couple of goats. The car was missing a fender. We looked like a caravan of vagabonds. We stopped in Athol, Massachusetts for gas. The attendant came over, looked in the window, saw the mess of children, dogs, and cats, noted the trailer behind, heard the screaming children, the bleating of goats, the barking of dogs, the neighing of the pony. So he leaned in and he asked my father, "Where are you folks headed?" My father replied, "To my mother-in-law's." And his bemused response, "Does she know you're coming?" She did, actually. Good question, though. There were tears in my mother's eyes when on August 10th, 1962, Caroline, who was then my girlfriend and now my wife, and I left my parents' home on Middle Hancock Road in Peterborough for Boston. The next day, she put me on a bus for Fort Dix. And my mother rarely cried or showed emotion, so I thought it odd. I was only going into the active military service for 6 months and there were no wars. Korea had been over for almost 10 years and Vietnam was in the future. It was only later that I realized the cause of those tears. The war in Europe had only been over for 17 years, a lifetime for a young man of 21, but nearby history for my mother who had suffered the worry of a husband exposed to the murderous shelling from German troops on the Italian front. History is told through big events, ideas, science, inventions, political elections, financial booms, and busts, and marching armies. Yet it is individuals who generate those ideas, do the science, and create inventions, comprise those politicians, benefit or suffer through market dislocations, and who make up those marching armies. Armies, ships, and planes, which are pins on a map or blips on a screen to generals, admirals, and politicians, represent hundreds of thousands, even millions of individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And most of their thoughts and reflections never make it into history books. But through diaries and letters, they can. Letters allow us to learn not only about the writer and the recipient, but they teach us about the age and the time in which the correspondents lived. In an interview with the magazine Smithsonian about the war letters he has collected, over 150,000 from the Revolutionary War to Vietnam, Andrew Carroll told the film producer, April White, "These letters are America's great undiscovered literature. They give insight into war and into human nature." In first reading the letters of my parents, it felt like being an ear on their bedroom wall. But as I read them, first the letters from my father and then from my mother, I decided that given the years that had gone by, and with all of those to whom they referred having died, the letters had a value beyond simply satisfying a personal curiosity. They speak of a time and a place, of ordinary people in extraordinary times. My father's letters were subject to censorship, so he could not tell my mother where he was or what was going on, not that he wanted to. Nevertheless, they tell the story of a soldier, older than most, and a married father of 4. His descriptions of other soldiers and of the countryside and his attempts at lightness, so as not to upset my mother, provide a perspective missing from most wartime histories, which concentrate on strategy and tactics, on those in command, and on the slaughter that they all experienced. However, in having access to the day-by-day history of his regiment, I was able to follow his company, platoon, and even his squad in a book that provided graphic details of enemy positions, battles, casualties, and topography, details that he could not and would not share with my mother. When my father was drafted, my mother returned with us to her family's home in the eastern section of Madison, Connecticut. Her letters give a sense of the home front, something historians have generally neglected. Food and gas were in short supply, with the latter being rationed and the former not always and easily available. Nevertheless, my mother and we children were more fortunate than most. My grandparents' home was spacious. It was on the beach and it had a barn for the goats, and my mother had bought with her, and for the pony and horse she bought while she was there. And between the animals, her garden, and her children, she was busy. My grandfather was often away on business, and my grandmother had her social life. My mother maintained a sense of optimism around us children, but her letters expressed the fear that seemed at times to overwhelm her. Her letters leave no doubt as to her love for my father, but they also reflected dependence on God to help her through the ordeal. They show her curiosity in following what was happening through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But one realizes the emotions pent up all day were released when she picked up her pen before going to bed. The letters in this book have been placed so that the reader can get a sense of an ongoing conversation, imperfect as the ordering was affected by delays in delivery. And of course, my father could not write when he was on the front, which he was at one point for 2.5 weeks. Quotations and footnotes have been added. Because of the number of animals mentioned, dogs, goats, and horses, the names have been placed in quotations. And the footnotes accompanying the letters are meant to make clearer people and events mentioned. But the letters remain as they were written 76 years ago. So while General Eisenhower was responsible for the European theater and General Lucian Prescott had the 5th Army, and General George Hayes had the 10th Mountain Division, the fighting was done by foot soldiers like my father. These were the men celebrated by cartoonist Bill Mauldin. With unshaven faces, mud and dirt were their constant companions. And when on the front, they were always filthy, almost always exhausted, and always scared. Over 98% of those who served in World War II were no longer with us. Nevertheless, according to the US Department of Veteran Affairs, approximately 300,000 are still alive, all in their 90s. My father was not anxious to go to war. At 34, his life was settled. He was married with 4 children. He was an artist, not a warrior, but he was a patriot, and when called, he went, and he went uncomplaining. What the book shows, I hope, is the human side of the war. My parents' love for one another, their children and their families, and some of the foibles of Army life and events back on the home front. But to return to this story, On the 19th of February, 1945, my father was on that assault on Mount Belvedere. It was a nighttime operation and continued with counterattacks for 6 days, but the Americans held the peak. In his recently published History of the 10th Mountain Division, The Winter War, Maurice Isserman writes, after the guns fell silent on Sunday, February 25th, there were 5 days of relative peace. 3 days after the attack on the 28th, my father wrote to my mother for the first time, Dear Mary, I am behind the lines again after spending another week on the front. This time it wasn't quite so comfortable with shells landing about and that sort of thing. But the weather was nice and it wasn't really too bad. I was in the attack on Mount Belvedere, which is more like a hill than a mountain, but I certainly didn't play a very active part, and I never even fired my rifle nor had any hairbreadth escapes or adventures to tell my grandchildren. There were crocuses in bloom on Mount Belvedere, and the view was beautiful both day and night, a strange setting for a battle. But despite that letter, or that paragraph in that letter, keep in mind that 213 members of the 10th were killed during those few days on Belvedere. 782 were wounded. And while the censors played a role, my father's real purpose in writing the way he did was not to upset my mother. But among those who died during those few quiet days on and around Belvedere was the first member of my father's squad to be killed. And that was on February 27th. On March 1st, my father wrote to my mother, I've had no adventurers, but for a piece of shrapnel which sliced a few hairs off my cheek, but I needed to shave anyway. My mother responded on March 12th, your adventure sounds like too close a shave to me. Did it really cut the skin or a near miss? And then 10 days later, my father answered her, yes, the shrapnel did cut my cheek just barely, but enough to bleed quite a bit, and it killed a man nearby. And the man it killed was a man named Private Juan Barrientos. In the introduction to this particular section, I write of Private Barrientos, who was an 18-year-old from Slayton, Texas. And he is buried at the American Cemetery south of Florence. And Caroline and I have visited his grave, and a photo of it that I took is included in the book. I also want to read just a few sentences from a letter my father wrote on March 21st. And this was just after what was known as the second offensive, which included the battle for Castle Dayano, which is where Senator Bob Dole was badly wounded. The letter relates to a story my father used to tell me when I was growing up. At the height of the worst shelling that we've undergone so far, I heard the first sergeant say that if he lived through this, he was going to spend the rest of his life writing on the futility of war. The remark and the way he said it tickled me, so that I didn't worry much about the rest of the shells. He lived through it all right, and I hope he starts writing. He's a very remarkable fellow that I would have liked to have known in civilian life. I've got to know him since I've been a runner. He's rather an intellectual, but surprisingly like Forrest Wilson in appearance, sense of humor, and mannerisms. He's Scandinavian. But with those two clues that he's Scandinavian and that he was a first sergeant, I was able to determine who he was talking about. And so in a footnote that I've attached to that, I write, he refers to Sergeant Lester S. Ersland of Ames, Iowa. Sergeant Ersland was killed on April 15th, just beyond the town of Torrey-Usi, on the second day of the spring offensive. So he was killed about 3 weeks later after my father had written about him before. But on that spring, as they fought their way out of the northern Apennines and into the Po Valley, and according to the history of the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, which was compiled by a Captain George F. Earle, Sergeant Ersland was blinded from dirt thrown into his eyes as snipers targeted him and the soldiers he was leading. He stepped on a shoe mine, stumbled and fell on 4 others and died instantly. The story is familiar to me because my father was one of the soldiers that he was leading at that point. The spring offensive, which is known as Operation Craftsman, began on April 14th, the day which proved to be the costliest day for the 10th. By the end of that day, 553 men of the 10th were dead, wounded, or missing in action. In his book, The History of the 87th Regiment that I referenced before by Captain Earl, he wrote, "The trail from the rear assembly area to the front was strewn with dead and dying men and mules. Artillery horses were falling like rain. The 10th swarmed out of the Apennines, crossed the Po River on the 22nd. My father was finally able to write home on the 30th, 2 days before the Germans and Italy surrendered. You've probably gathered from the papers that we've been pretty busy, and I don't know how much I can write about. We made the bridgehead across the Po River, which was without doubt the most exciting boat ride I ever took, and I hope never to take another like it. The 1st Battalion of the 10th, which was my father's battalion, had been the first to cross the Po. And as they were waiting on the south bank of the Po, another of my father's squad members was killed, a man named Chester Vest of Boswell, Arkansas. Regarding the Po crossing, my mother wrote to my father on May 10th, after the war in Europe was over. Minnie Dole told Daddy, who didn't tell me until now, that the division had been, as he put it, practically decimated in crossing the Po, so you can imagine how we all feel at home. The 10th bypassed Verona and headed to Lake Garda at the end of April. On that same day, on April 30th, that my father had written to my mother, she wrote to him, "I love you such an awful lot. It must be beautiful in the Alps. I wonder if it's cold, and I wonder if you're cold, and I wonder if you used or needed skis. I can hardly wait to hear if it's true. No more shots being fired on that front. I thank God with all my heart, and I know that in his goodness, he has spared you for us. But still, I'd like it in your handwriting. The only day I had any qualms about you was on Sunday, April 22nd. But I hope I was misinformed by our medium, that little spirit that floats between us." And of course, it was on the 22nd that my father was in the boat that crossing the Po River. The war in Italy ended on May 2nd, and in Europe 6 days later. But the 10th was scheduled for the planned invasion of Japan, which would have been commanded by General MacArthur and termed by some as the greatest invasion that ever happened. That prospect permeates the letters between my parents in the last 2.5 months he was in Italy. For example, my father writes to my mother on May 3rd that there didn't seem to be any particular celebrating at the news of the German armies throughout Italy and part of Austria had surrendered. I'm going to feel awfully impatient now until I find out whether I can go home eventually or whether I'll be sent east. That last would be awful. VE Day followed 6 days later on May 8th. On May 7th, my mother wrote to my father, "Can it be true that this really is VE Day? I wonder, can Stalin be stalling, or what is it? It means the end of one war, the start of another. Little chance of seeing our husbands, sons, and brothers, and only more sorrow for those who have lost theirs. Only the people unconnected with the suffering and separation are in any mood to celebrate." On July 15th, he wrote from Plezzo, north of Udine, and they were up near what is now the Slovenia border. "You've no doubt seen in the papers that we're coming home to be back in the middle of August and have 3 months training and then the Pacific. Now everyone's elation at coming home is tempered by the Pacific prospects." It was not until the end of July that President Truman decided to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And it wasn't until the second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki that Emperor Hirohito decided to call it quits. By that time, my father and the 87th were aboard the USS Mount Vernon bound for home. A war that had lasted 1,359 days was over. 407,000 Americans were dead and another 670,000 wounded. a high price so that millions in Europe and Asia would be free. My father was one of the lucky ones who made it home unscathed. From Fort Carson, where he was discharged, he wrote my mother on October 19th, 1945. I become more and more surprised that I ever lived through it all. There would have been very few of us left if it had lasted any longer. Somehow now, I feel as though you'd been helping me all the time. As I said at the start, Dear Mary is a love story, but it is also a testament to the men and women who served. The letters have been divided into 5 sections arranged by day, and each section is preceded by an introduction. As well, explanatory footnotes give the reader a better sense of what was happening on the ground when the letters were being written, and to explain people, places, and animals referenced. And I want to end by reading just a couple of sentences from the dedication. We in the world are freer, richer, and safer because of the sacrifice such men made. They deserve our remembrance and prayers, and that is why this book is dedicated to those who served in the 10th Mountain Division during the Second World War. Thank you for listening, and I'd be glad to hear, I'd love to hear some comments, or if you have any questions, if that can be arranged. And I hope you heard me.
Thank you, Sid. That was great. I love that. Folks, I just wanted to let you know, in case you came in a little late, that the publisher of his book, Dear Mary, Bauhan Publishing, is giving everyone a discount. So in the chat section, you'll see a link, and it's $10 off. It's originally a $24 book. They're putting it down to $14 for anyone who wants to buy the book. And you have a couple weeks to do it. So I just wanted to let you know that first, so that you know about that. I'm free to open it up to questions or comments. If anyone would like to say anything, or you can unmute yourselves, or you can, write in the chat box, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Hi there. My name is Bud Kennedy. I live in Park City part of the time, and in Old Lyme, Connecticut, near Sydney the rest of the time. And I've read the book, and so I can't tell you how much I can recommend it. And there's one thing Sydney didn't mention, which I wanted to add, is the language in the letters. This is the language of the 40s. And you're getting an education on how people talk. I mean, just for example, they refer to a little kid as, isn't he cunning? Have you heard that word recently? Probably in the last 25 years. So it's good stuff. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And Diane, if there's anybody who actually served in the tent who happened to be on, I'd love to hear from them.
Okay. Is anyone served in the 10th? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. So, yeah. Okay, any other questions or comments, or?
So Diane, where can you get this book? Will it be available at the museum?
It's not available at the museum, but you can access the link that's in the chat box.
But I don't see the link.
Okay, it should be there. Otherwise, I can send it to everybody tomorrow, that's what I can do, is I can send you the link, and you can look at, check into buying a book. We just didn't have enough time to get the books to the store, and that's why we didn't do it that way.
Oh, thank you for sending it in the email. That would be easier. I don't see it in the chat either. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I will do that then.
Thanks, Diane. I think it'd be an interesting book, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Okay.
Sydney, thanks for sharing your story with us. That was absolutely tremendous. When did your dad, I assume he passed away by now. When did that happen?
He died in 1960, and lung cancer was what killed him. And unfortunately, so many of the soldiers back then, and people smoked, and I think that's really what did him off.
Yeah, the 4 cigarette Pall Malls and Lucky Strikes and their MREs, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You look at pick up a 1950s Life magazine, and you'll see an ad on the back of it for Camels or Chesterfield from, this is what I'm a doctor, and this is what I recommend as a doctor, that you smoke Camels. I mean, it's incredible. But we've gone a long ways, I mean, thank God.
How old were you when your dad passed away?
I was 27.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, so my oldest two children were born before he died. He fell down.
Right. Right. Well, he sounds like he was quite a man.
He was good fun. He didn't attend reunions, but when we would go skiing, and he saw somebody who had the insignia, the 10th Round Division insignia on their cap or on their parka, he always went up and spoke to them, and it was sort of fun because it allowed me to meet some of these people. Most of them were younger than he was. I mean, certainly most of the enlisted men were younger than he was.
So he never attended any official reunion for the 10th Mountain?
He never did.
Yeah.
Most of the reunions got going. I've talked to a lot of people in the alumni from the 10th and even descendants of the 10th. And I think most of these reunions began in the 1970s and perhaps 1980s, when people felt more comfortable speaking about, what happened to them during the war.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as Tom Brokaw says, the greatest generation. My dad was skipper of the LST 890 in World War II. A kid from South Bend, Indiana.
Right.
And my respect and affection for him is matched by your respect and affection for your dad, obviously.
Where was your father based on the LST?
Well, they picked the ship up down in New Orleans. It had just been built in the Draco shipyard in Pittsburgh and came down the river system.
Right.
Then they went through the Panama Canal and out into the South Pacific. And they landed on the Japanese mainland about a week after the Nagasaki H-bomb.
Oh, wow.
And his letters to his dad that my mom has kept,
Right.
describing the landing party and the citizens that they encountered are memorable. They're incredible letters.
Right. No, this is another story. I had an uncle, my mother's youngest brother, was commanded in LST and mostly in Europe, and he was involved. I forget what they called it, the invasion of southern France in August of 1945, instead of in late August of 1945, and he commanded this LST, and Winston Churchill happened to be there, and he was sort of parading up and down where these ships had been anchored. So down one row, and then up another row, and down one row. And when he passed by my Uncle Joe's LST, Uncle Joe wrote to his mother about the fact that he was only about 50 feet away from Churchill, and he said he was dressed in his blue pajamas, or whatever he called it, that blue play suit. He said, looking as much like Little Sydney as he could.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I'm very appreciative of you sharing your time and story with us. And thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, Sid. This is Bonnie Park.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi there. I'm on a similar path as you. I've been writing actually a trilogy of series of 3 books based on letters that I found after my parents passed away. And the second in the trilogy is the time frame from 1941 to 1945. My dad was in the Pacific. And I'm curious, I have a couple questions. Were you able to talk to your mom about these letters, or when did you find these letters? Had your parents both passed?
they both died when I got these letters. Because I got my mother died in 1990, in December of 1990. And when she died, she had my father's letters. She had both her letters and my father's letters. And I ended up getting my father's letters, and my sister, my older sister, got my mother's letters. And so what happened was I took my father's letters and I looked at them and I said, "This is great," and I privately printed the letters. I had them privately printed, and because I felt they were just remarkable, I loved the way that they were. And then a few years after that, my sister died, and her oldest daughter had these letters. And she called me one time and we spoke, and she said, it would be wonderful to put these letters together to see if we could create a book. And so she gave me my mother's letters, and I went through them, and I printed most of them. I didn't print all of them. I mean, I took out some things. I mean, as Bud had mentioned, that some of the wording that people used back then was is quite sort of unique at the time, and some of it isn't strictly.
There's lots that swell. Everything swell.
Well, I wouldn't mind, but there were some words that they used that just, and I'm not a politically correct person, but I just found that I thought it would be better not to include certain letters. So I decided not to, but that's when we put them together. But my mother and father never knew I had done this, and I don't think they would have liked it, because the letters were really private. They were between the two of them. But I decided that they were dead, and I couldn't rule them, and they wouldn't interfere with me. It's my decision, and I think it was the right decision, because it's the best way for people in writing letters. If you're not a famous person, what you really do is you expose yourself, and so you really learn a lot about these people. When Thomas Jefferson and John Adams wrote to each other, they knew that their letters would be historic, and so they wanted to make sure that they didn't say anything that they shouldn't say. But when my parents and your parents write to one another, that was, they weren't thinking that these letters would ever be made public. But that's what makes them so valuable, in my opinion. Makes them so fascinating.
Oh, I agree. I say at one point in my book, like it or not, they're cast into this book because it's lovely history. I have one other question. One fun fact that I came across was that for the 10th Mountain Division, they discovered, moving into the war years, that it was easier to teach men to shoot than it was to teach them to ski. So they were actively recruiting skiers for the 10th Mountain Division. Have you heard that?
I've not heard that specifically, but I'm not too surprised. I mean, my father had been a skier, and he had started skiing in the late 1920s, and used to take what they called a ski train, which went from Boston North Station in Boston up towards Mount Washington, and to near Canmore, and then they would then somehow get from there, North Conway, up to Picken Notch, and then ski on Mount Washington. And so he loved to ski, but some of his friends were really good skiers and did a lot more of it than he did. But we always skied a lot, but there were a lot of people in the tent. By the time they actually went to Italy, probably more than half of them had never skied. I mean, the two people that I mentioned that were in the squad that were killed, neither one of them had ever skied. They were both from the South. One from Arkansas, one from Texas.
So they were athletic and learned. Yeah. Well, lovely. This has been very fun to listen to. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for listening.
Sid, there's a question or comment in the chat section that I just want to read to you. It says, wonderful letters. Thank you so much for sharing this experience that your parents and you had. My brother gathered letters that our grandparents wrote to each other during the Civil War. He wrote a play about it and has been performed over 100 times. Those experiences too cross time with emotions and caring just as yours do. Do you have any thoughts about the fact that people don't write letters to each other anymore? These wonderful memories and histories won't be available to future generations. Wonder what your thoughts might be about that.
Well, I think it's sad, but it's probably true. I mean, if somebody, I mean, young people go onto the internet and they'll write text messages or emails without sort of thinking. But if you're thinking at all, you're very careful about what you say in a public forum. So I think it's too bad. It's unfortunate. I don't know how that changes, how that's going to change. I think it's something that we have to live with.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions, comments, anything else? No?
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, well, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Sid, for sharing. It was very, it was wonderful to hear. And thank you all for attending. And I will get that link to you shortly about the book so that you will have it, okay?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good
Take care.
night,
Take
everybody.
care, Sid.
Yeah.
Sid, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Diane.
So that just
Yeah.
cuts us.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Mark, oh, Sid, Mark
Yeah.
just asked if you have a prized possession from your father.
Is it okay to leave now?
Yes. Well, I have several prized possessions. I mean,
Maybe I didn't.
he won the Bronze Star. I have that. But my most prized possessions are probably some of the sculpture that he did. I have pieces of sculpture that he did. And,
It's wind.
yes.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Right.
So thank you for.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, for arranging this. This is great.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bud, for telling me about Sid. I appreciate it.
You're totally welcome. And Sid, we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Exactly. Looking forward to that. All right.
Bye-bye. All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay. Take care. Have a good night.